Do you ever store your photos and stuff in the cloud so you don't fill up the memory on your phone? Back when I was about 7 years old, I lived right near my cousin Dave, and we did everything together. Well, one day we found this baby bird, and we named him George. Now, George was big for a baby bird, and ugly. Ugh. Now, Dave and I were pretty good at naming birds like robins and blue jays, but more importantly, we had both heard the story of the ugly duckling. So we knew without a doubt, any day now, George was going to change into this majestic swan. But George didn't know how to swim. So we went on down to the dime store and we bought George a pair of water wings. Pink is the only color they had. But believe it or not, George still did not want to swim. And we just figured because he didn't like pink, that being a girl color and all. But we were eventually enlightened on the subject by one of our classmates. Little Lucy Know-It-All, of all people. You idiots! That's not a swan. That's a turkey vulture. Well, we were shocked to hear such a thing about George. But by this time, George was our friend, so we couldn't just desert him. And as it turned out, George must have actually loved pink because he wore those pink water wings all the time. Problem is, with those water wings on, George could not flap his wings fast enough to get off the ground. George couldn't fly. Now, there's something I need to tell you about Dave. How should I put this? Dave was a nerd. I mean, he was always reading that Scientific American magazine. But, well, it enabled Dave to come up with a great solution to our problem. We took my bicycle all the way to the top of Walker's Hill. Dave got on behind me, stood George up on my head with his wings spread out. And with Dave holding George in place, I started pedaling down that hill just as fast as I could pedal. And about halfway down the hill, I felt George rise up off my head. And those water wings actually gave George extra lift, which is too bad because Dave forgot to let go. As George gained altitude and pulled out ahead, there was Dave dangling down below, hanging on for dear life with his legs a-flailing in the air. I didn't know what to do. But fortunately, George spotted this furniture truck that just happened to be going down the road, and George managed to let Dave off on the top of that truck, which would have been okay, but Dave immediately plopped down on his bottom. And when the driver heard the noise, he hit the brakes. So Dave slid forward off the top of that truck onto the roof of the cab, down the windshield, across the hood, and finally came to a stop with one leg on each side of the hood ornament. I don't think that truck driver believed Dave's story, but he was still nice enough to give Dave a ride back to my house. Now, George landed and threw his water wings on the ground. Pretty good indication he'd had all the bicycle takeoffs he wanted. And Dave, well, Dave had to go home and change his pants. And when he came back, he had this magazine that he happened to just find laying around in the bottom of his older brother's dresser drawer. It was a Sports Illustrated magazine, the swimsuit issue. We'd heard enough about that magazine that we were afraid to look inside, but we did it anyway. My reaction? We better hide that thing before we get in trouble. Now, Dave, being the avid Scientific American reader he was, said, let's hide it in the cloud. Okay. Now, the cloud was real new back then, and Dave may not have fully understood all of the idiosyncrasies of how it was to be implemented. But we tied a helium balloon onto that magazine and gave it to George to take up to the biggest cloud we could see there in the sky. It turned out to be a thunderhead. About the time George got back, there was a flash of lightning, crash of thunder, and our magazine, along with everything else in that cloud, dropped out of the bottom of the cloud into our pond. It's just a good thing those ladies were wearing their swimsuits, isn't it? Well, sure, George ran in the barn to hide. But in a little while, he came out and he was wearing his pink water wings. Now, it wasn't pretty, but George managed to swim out into that pond and salvage our magazine. A little damp, maybe, but pretty good shape. Now, I'd had it with the cloud myself. But Dave insisted we try again and this time use a fluffy white cloud. So we sent George off again. While he was gone, Dave's older brother showed up. And you know, he wasn't happy. He asked us about his magazine, and well, Dave and I just played dumb. We were real good at that. And we said we didn't have the magazine, which was technically true because that magazine by this time was safely stored in the cloud. Well, as if the day wasn't bad enough, the local game warden showed up at my house and said, "Boys, it's against the law to keep a turkey vulture as a pet. I'll be back tomorrow with the cage to take him away." And there was nothing we could do. The next morning, when the game warden showed up, George was circling around above our house. We stood out there and watched as George made a low pass, and we saw he was wearing his pink water wings and flying faster than usual. As George went over the game warden's truck, he made a hefty deposit on the game warden's windshield before soaring high into the air and disappearing into a cloud. There was a rumble. 2 pink water wings dropped from the sky. The cloud dissipated. The sky was clear. And George was gone forever. Now, there's a disadvantage to storing stuff in the cloud. If you forget your password or your turkey vulture disappears while running from the law, you lose access to everything you got stored in the cloud. Dave and I lost that classic Sports Illustrated magazine almost 70 years ago. And then just this morning, I lost the end of this story that I swore I had safely stored in the cloud. But, you know, somehow, Dave and I both made it to adulthood. Now, we didn't get to spend as much time together as we had in the past, but we still got together now and then to do things. I remember one time we were going to go canoeing on Sandy Creek. We went down to the creek and it'd been a little dry, and in fact, there wasn't enough water in that creek to float a canoe. So we decided we'd get together after the next decent rain and we'd go canoeing. Well, it was 4 or 5 weeks before one Friday night we got a good rain. So I went down to the creek on Saturday morning, and well, that rain was heavier than I had thought it was, because not only was the creek full from bank to bank, but it had flooded a 20-acre field out there in the creek bottom. Well, Dave never did show up, but it was such a pretty day, I decided I'd just go ahead and go canoeing on my own. So I started out paddling, but when I got past that flooded field, the hills started closing in on the creek and the water got deeper and the current got faster. And I passed this doghouse floating down the creek. It had a big rooster on top of it. And when that rooster saw me, he just started crowing. Now, I don't speak chicken, so I cannot say for sure what he said, but it sounded to me like he said, "Cock-a-doodle-doo! Sure glad I'm not in with you," which was just a little bit disheartening. But it wasn't until I saw the mallard duck that I began to worry some. That mallard duck was wearing pink water wings. Well, the water got deeper and the current got faster. And I heard a rumble up ahead, like a waterfalls or rapids or something, and as fast as I was going, whatever it was, I was going over it. It wasn't until I got right up to it, I saw it was a huge beaver dam. My canoe shot over that dam, flew through the air, dropped down about 8 feet, hit the water, skipped once, bounced, and landed on the trunk of this tree that was falling down and was sloping up out of the water. There I sat, out of the water, soaking wet, and I lost my paddle. And I want to tell you, when you're canoeing, there is not much worse than being stuck up a tree without a paddle. Well, sir, I got to looking around and wondering what kind of a beaver builds a dam like that one. When swimming up the creek towards me was the answer. This humongous beaver. That beaver was 4 or 5 times bigger than any beaver I'd ever seen in my life. And in his mouth, that beaver was dragging my paddle. Well, sir, I tied a loop on the end of the rope that's on the front of the canoe. As that beaver went by, I lassoed my paddle. That beaver never even slowed down. He pulled me in the canoe right out of that tree and back into the water. Then that beaver swam up to the dam and started going over. And that's when I saw why that beaver was so big. That beaver was half buffalo. His shoulders and chest were just massive, and he had little horns coming out the side of his head. Well, sir, that beaver climbed to the top of that dam, was just ready to go over the top when, pow, he flew off of there backwards like he'd been hit in the head or something. And on the way down, he let out this blood-curdling, it sounded just like a mad buffalo. But in the process, my paddle slipped out of his mouth. So I started paddling downstream. And it's a good thing I did, because when that beaver came back to the surface, he was mad, took his big old flat tail, slammed it down in the water, must have thrown water, I don't know, 23 feet in the air. He'd swamped my canoe for sure if I'd still been around there. But I was paddling on down the creek, having a good time, going pretty fast. When I rounded a bend, and what do I see in front of me but the bridge for the light plant road? Now, the light plant road had been closed for years because the bridge was out. But the I-beams for that bridge were still there across the creek, about 7 inches off the water. Way too low to go under, and the speed I was going, there was no way my canoe was going to survive crashing into those I-beams. At this point, I did what I like to think any sane, right-thinking man would do in a situation like that. I panicked. I started paddling just as hard as I could paddle for the creek bank. The current caught my canoe, turned it sideways, and wrapped it right around a tree. I managed to jump up, grab onto that tree, stood there on the remains of my canoe, wondering what in the world I was going to do. The water was too fast and too deep. There was no way I was going to be able to wade over to the creek bank. This tree was like a telephone pole. The nearest branches were way up above my head. I got to looking around. What am I going to do? What am I going to do when I see that duck I'd seen earlier in the day swimming down the creek? That duck. And I knew it was the same one because I recognized the yellow lilies on his pink water wings. And then it hit me. That's somebody's pet duck. Where would a wild duck get pink water wings? So I just called him over. Here, ducky duck, here, ducky duck. He swam right over to me, looked up at me, and started quacking like he was trying to tell me something. But you know, I don't speak duck a bit better than I speak chicken. So I had no idea what he was saying. It wasn't long till he got fed up with it and flew off. Now what am I supposed to do? But then, in just a little while, I saw Ducky coming back, and why, there was a little spool of wire hanging down from his bill, and there was a hook dangling off the end of that wire. Well, sir, he came flying right at that tree I was on, just a little bit above my head, and just as he got to the tree, he swerved to the side, but the hook caught on the tree. He went around that tree about 7 times. And then he flew off to another tree back 15 or 20 feet from the creek bank, and he must have gone around that tree, I don't know, 13 times. And then he did this quadruple corkscrew maneuver, wrapped the wire right around itself, dropped the spool, and flew off again. What in the world's going on here? I don't know. But just a little while, Ducky came back. And this time he's got a little packet hanging down from his bill. And he flew right over me and dropped that packet. And I reached out and caught it. Right on the side of it, it said, microcarbon fiber zip line harness, 500-pound capacity. Who might argue? I got into that harness, zipped it up, shinnied up the tree a bit, took the little pulley, put it on the wire, lifted up my feet, and I ziplined from that tree across the water over to the creek bank where I dropped down and gasped for air. What a day! Well, I sat there leaning back against a tree, and Ducky landed and jumped up in my lap and started giving me little duck kisses all over the face. That's when I noticed there was a chain around his neck, and on that chain was a 3-ounce can of Mountain Dew. You know, like the barrels that the St. Bernards wear in the Alps. And on the outside of that can was Ducky Duck's official Homeland Security undercover rescue duck identification. Was I lucky or what? Thank you.